Ladies and gents, we have today with us, and mentioned in the Keith Richardson's presentation, is Dr. Helen Robinson. And we're going to ask Dr. Helen Robinson to come to the front. Dr. Helen Robinson has done lots and lots of research about the history of Wynberg, and we have had many years of chats with Dr. Ellenson and her research of forced removals in the Cape, whether it be the Overberg, Greyton, whether it be Wynberg, whether it be Sea Point and Green Point. She has really done an exceptional work with the research of all of these areas. And she's earned her PhD in all of this research, master's as well as PhD. And she is also an actor. So if you ever want to see Shakespeare in action, here is the embodiment of Shakespeare in action. So please welcome, with a round of applause, Dr. Helen Robinson.
You know, when I bought a house in Wynberg about 48 years ago, so I really am a Wynbergian, I did not realize that my entire life was going to be taken over by Wynberg. It just happened naturally. Now, I bought the house and we moved in. And my mother said to me, after a week or two, you know, I was born here in Victoria Hospital. I said, really? And she was at that time in her mid-70s, and she told me that in fact my great-grandparents are buried here. And she also told me they'd lived in Mortimer Road. Now, with a Wynberg history behind me, I decided I would go back in my more mature years to university. And I decided that I would write something, a book perhaps, about Wynberg. I mention this because while I was writing, I realized something. We study history and we learn all sorts of things from it. But heritage is something quite different. It depends on history. But what is important is that when you look at heritage, you are looking at more than events and history. What you're looking at is history with emotional input. And you are looking at history which is tied very definitely to people. And, you know, people are tied to places. And this link between people and place is one of the most interesting parts of history. Because history is made by people, whether we like it or not. And some of it may come back to haunt us in later years. And some of our more recent history may come back to haunt others in the future. Now, Wynberg began almost by accident. Why should it be called Wynberg Well, I'll give you a brief, very brief introduction as to how things just happen. And this is what heritage is all about. We inherit from our previous ancestors all sorts of stories. Some of them a bit iffy, others all sorts of things we can be proud of. But we go back as Wynberg residents as having descended from a long way back. Now, when the Cape was made into a settlement by the Dutch East India Company, a refreshment station for their trading ships, they established what we know today as Cape Town, a very different city. But in the beginning, they only wanted to develop a little bit of the Cape, just enough to suit their purposes. Now, the first governor, as every child is taught in school, was Jan van Riebeeck. Now, Jan van Riebeeck was granted a farm on the other side of Wynberg Hill. This was done so that he could look towards the Cape and the development area, and he would then be able to keep an eye on things. But another man, another governor, came to the Cape about 30 years later. He went up onto Wynberg Hill and he looked southwards and he liked what he saw. Now, ironically, something happened which was important for Wynberg, because this was Governor Simon van der Stel. And he stood on Wynberg Hill and he thought to himself, I'd like a bit of that. And he looked around him and he decided it would be possible to offer plots for sale. And he offered 3 big farms. One was up on the hill, down as far as about the old Wynberg village, up near the military camp. The other one was a little further over, and it went as far as Constantia Road. And the third one was on the other side of the road, and later the railway line. And it was called, rather surprisingly, Rust en Werk. Perhaps they considered that to be the better order to take it in. But Rust en Werk is where we stand or sit today. This is the land that was named Rust en Werk. And it goes all the way, or went all the way, from Witten Road to just beyond here. Now, this particular farm is the one I'm going to talk about. I've written a lot about the other 2 farms and this one, but I've decided to just confine myself to a couple of stories about this plot. Now, Simon van der Stel got the first farm, Oude Wynberg, on the hill, and he called it the Oude Wynberg because it was one of the oldest places. And he decided that he would buy it. Unfortunately for him, the Dutch East India Company were very pleased with what he'd been doing as a governor. They thought, well done, old chap. We will give you a little reward. So they gave him Constantia. Now, this was a piece of ground which stretched all the way from Wynberg Hill to the Steenberg. And that was a pretty good gift. He had to decide, so he did decide. And he took Constantia, and he gave Oude Wynberg on the hill to his son. And the other two farms went ahead. They developed. For the first 100 years, and you know, history is always a little bit weird in this way. We look at things in hundreds of years sometimes, not in our modern style of today, tomorrow, and maybe next week. But it was a slow time. So it was a slow beginning, but it was a popular beginning. People liked the place, and who wouldn't? And therefore, it developed rapidly as farmland up there over the railway line. Down here, there was a slightly slower development. It was a good farm. Those days, it was farmed by slaves who worked for the farmers. And they did very well. It was a good, productive piece of ground. And then time passed. There was no change. The three farms basically remained. But then there was a change of management. Now, the Dutch East India Company went bankrupt. They'd misjudged the power of the other trading companies, one of which was British, the English East India Company, and they went out of business. And by an arrangement, which we won't go into here, the British took over the Cape. Now, when the British took over the Cape, there were changes. Oh. Yes, well, that's tricky. Okay. The British took over the Cape. And they decided to develop this part. It was good stuff here. And they did develop it. And the British moved in, took over most of the farm, subdivided in the upper part of Wynberg, and they also took over farms in this part of Wynberg. Now, the people I was going to talk to you about, but I may not have time, the people who they were going to talk to us about, I was going to talk to you about, were the people who, as was indicated when Keith spoke about the countess, the black countess, It was a mixed-race neighborhood. Now, Wynberg had always got on fairly well with mixed race. In fact, there was a lot of it. And people got used to working together. And when Rust in Werk came on the market, it was bought principally by two men who had families. One was a man named Bat, Henry Bat, and he bought this bit, this end of Rust in Werk. A few years later, he bought in the 1820s, and he farmed very successfully here. He bred cattle, and he was extremely proud of his large, impressive, and terrifying bull. He used to come down, he made his money, by the way, as a vintner, selling wines of the Cape, which were now very popular. And what he had to do was to make enough money to retire in comfort to the big piece of land he had bought from Rust in Werk. He was out one day in the fields, admiring his bull. Unfortunately, the affection was not returned. And what happened was that the bull took him in his sights, charged directly towards him, and gored him almost to death. It's not quite sure, actually, in the records of the day, whether he died on the spot or whether they took him home and he died there. Now, it was sad. His wife was devastated. She had two problems. She had a very large black bull carcass to bury. She also had her much-loved husband to bury. She decided that she would combine the two responsibilities. The bull went in first into a big hole at the bottom end of the fields near the school, and Mr. Bat went in on top in a respectable coffin. On top of that, they put an even more respectable little vault. And there that stood for many, many years. I'm sorry to say that Mrs. Bat didn't stay in the Cape. She went back to the village of Plumstead in England, where both of them had come from. And consequently, we now know where Plumstead got its name. Now, after that, another family bought, not far, just across the way, near the railway station. And they came out. He was a wagoner, a popular profession in those days, because there were no other means of transport. And he looked at the land next door to Mr. Bat, and he bought it. Now, this man was a pragmatic sort of guy. He had actually been in town between there and Wynberg. When he moved, just before he moved to Wynberg, he married the adopted daughter of the Imam of the Palm Tree Mosque in town, who had married her mother. And she came out to Wynberg with him, and they established the Raycliffe family. Any Raycliffes here? Good. And they lived a happy marriage together with several children, and they farmed the land as well as being wagoners. But they also were very, very shrewd. They knew that the place one day would be very important. And they laid the foundations for that importance. So not far from the vault of Henry Brett, and nearby was the farm of the Raycliffe family. A big piece of land that went all the way from the main road right down to the other end where the street is, was. Now, these two families were very, very different, but they got along pretty well. And they made a start in this area of Wynberg, the old Wynberg farm. Now, as far as I can see, that was the basic structure which was imposed on this farm. There were other smaller farms. One of them developed into the Rothfelder Inn. The other one was perhaps a little more broken up. It stands where Maynard Mall is today. And the two little cottages, you know, up on the hill. Now, all this had the most wonderful stories to them. The Raycliffes, because they didn't have to die, to be well known and respected and appreciated in this area. The Bats, because their time was done. And they left us a large piece of ground for children to play on, and a vault, which some of the children played in. Also, there you go, yes, your daddy. Yes. As children. So I've been trying to indicate that Wynberg is a combination of history and old history. We go back to the Khoisan people who were living on the hills here at Wynberg. They too saw a good thing and exploited it. And we have come a long way since then. With the aid of contributions by the local people. For instance, the Raycliffe family sold half their farm, and the railway came through. Above the railway line, they built a most beautiful mosque for the people of Wynberg. One of the things that struck me when looking at Wynberg was the way the people all worked together to do things for Wynberg. Martha's thought that you heard about in the previous talk was to provide the education in the area which was not there before and which they needed. That gave us a good chuckle, somewhat irreverently, as the poor man is lying there, very deep still. Unfortunately, the little vault collapsed and died as well. But I thought these two stories were worth telling. I got a tremendous amount of pleasure out of living in Wynberg. The fact that it practically took over my life, I take as par for the course. I've had a very good return on my investment. And I think that if this Wynberg Civic, to whom I was affiliated, in fact, I think I served on the committee, didn't I? Yes, I did. And I still see people I remember from that time. If the people of Wynberg go ahead as the earlier people of Wynberg did, with remarkable success, they cooperated until, well, I don't have to talk about that, but you know what. And consequently, we have now the opportunity to pick up from where we left off and go ahead, united in a group like a civic, where we can do things for each other, as the early people of Wynberg did. And they built something, didn't they? So we can just nod our heads faintly and say, well done. And if you want more, there are 3 books, which are all out of print, unfortunately, at the moment, but you can read them in the library at Wynberg and elsewhere. If they don't knock down the Plumstead Library, you can read one there. But I think Wynberg stands as almost, have we had a lockdown?
No kidding.
And that is what I have to do.
I just need to say that we, with Doctor, we've had many, many teas. We just bring the cake. Doc makes the most fantastic tea. I'm not going to give you her address, but we've learned so much from Doc about the history of Wynberg, about the history of the family called the Reckler family, and all the properties and all that they've owned and all the things that they have done. Doc, thank you so very much. We know that your son won't allow you for public speaking, but I must say to you, thank you so much for allowing us. We could not have a Wynberg Rewind with a person that has studied so much and that has done a doctoral thesis on the removal of the people from their original areas. May you be spared for many, many more years. I know that you've got 3 more chapters left of your, is it your Sea Point?
Yes.
Your Sea Point book, and may that be finished, and may you enjoy many, many more other books besides Lovato Link and Wynberg Beyond the City Limits and all of those. Thank you so much, Doc, for coming. I know that you promised you will come, and you did. Thank you so much. And to hand over to you, Mr. Ahmad Edmonds. my dad, and can I read what it says? In recognition of contribution, Wynberg East Civic Association appreciates Dr. Helen Robinson for the research, documentation, and preservation of history and untold stories. Wynberg Rewind, 24 September 2022. All yours. Thank you. Thank you so much.